Auctioned as a breeder, the Omega hit a wrist marked with the dead Luna's name of the Alpha King. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Alara Whitmore stood beneath the white lights of the Breeder Exchange Hall, the air cool enough to prickle her skin, the scent of polished stone and antiseptic drifting through a room designed to feel clean while stripping away dignity. And she kept her eyes lowered not out of shame but strategy, because looking up invited attention and attention invited questions, and questions could lead to the one truth she could never afford to reveal. The placard at her feet reduced her to statistics measured in inches and years, spoken in a tone meant to sound efficient. And Alara focused on the steady rhythm of her breathing, counting silently the way her mother once taught her when panic crept close, for counts in, for counts out, grounding herself in the present moment. Around her, voices murmured with the practiced distance of people discussing inventory, not a person, and she learned to let those sounds pass like wind against glass, because reacting would give them something they wanted. Her right wrist ached beneath the wrap she'd tied too tightly on purpose. A simple strip of cloth meant to look like an old injury, but beneath it lay a mark she hid as if it were fire, a name etched in pale silver lines that sometimes warmed as if remembering a heartbeat, a name whispered only in her thoughts, Seraphine, a name that belonged to a Luna the realm believed long gone. Alara knew what the mark meant even if she didn't fully understand why it had chosen her, and she knew the warnings that followed it, because every warning came with a story about silence being the difference between survival and disappearance. She shifted her weight slightly, careful to keep her posture neutral, shoulders relaxed, chin down, the stance of someone who didn't draw. Focus. And she noticed how the room changed as bids were considered, how footsteps slowed, how the lights hummed softly overhead, how time stretched when nothing happened and snapped tight when someone spoke. She kept her hands clasped, the wrapped wrist hidden beneath her other palm, the way a person hides a candle from the wind, and reminded herself that endurance could look like stillness. Somewhere beyond the hall's wide doors, the city carried on with ordinary sounds, traffic a few blocks away, a siren fading, life continuing as if this room were a sealed pocket outside the world, and the contrast steadied her resolve. Alara had learned to be patient, to wait for the moment when circumstances shifted on their own, because they always did, and though she couldn't see it yet, she trusted that something unseen was moving closer, not because hope was easy, but because she had survived by believing that the story was not finished, not for her, and not for the mark that warmed quietly beneath the cloth. The murmurs in the Breeder Exchange Hall shifted as minutes passed, not louder but sharper, like edges finding one another, and Alara felt the change before she understood it, the way a room tightens when attention begins to circle. Numbers were spoken, careful and detached, and she learned to listen without reacting, letting them pass through her like static, because reacting meant becoming visible, and visibility was a risk she could not afford. She kept her gaze on the polished floor, noticing how the lights reflected in pale lines that reminded her of frozen rivers, and she wondered briefly if anyone else ever noticed details like that, or if she was alone in seeing small, quiet things while the world measured worth in louder ways. Someone closer laughed softly, not cruelly, but with the casual confidence of a person who never expected to be denied, and Alara felt the familiar urge to draw inward, to make herself smaller, because smaller had always meant safer. Her wrapped wrist tingled again, not painful, just warm, as if the skin beneath the cloth were reacting to the air itself, and she tightened her fingers together to hide the movement, reminding herself that marks were only dangerous if they were seen. She remembered being told that destiny was loud, that it announced itself with spectacle, but what she had learned instead was that destiny often arrived quietly, in moments when no one was paying attention, and she wondered which version was true. The exchange attendant cleared his throat and adjusted his tablet, listing features in a neutral voice meant to sound professional, and Alara felt her jaw tighten at the language, at how easily a person could be reduced to categories that fit neatly on a screen. She focused on breathing again, steady and controlled, because panic had no place here, and she had survived worse rooms by remaining calm. As another bid was considered, a subtle hush fell, not complete silence, but something close, the kind that made every sound feel louder by contrast. And Alara sensed movement near the entrance, a presence that altered the rhythm of the space without announcing itself. She did not look up, not yet, because instinct told her that whatever had changed was significant, and significant things required caution. The warmth beneath her wrap intensified briefly, then settled, like a pulse finding its pace, and her thoughts flickered to the name she never spoke aloud, the one etched beneath the cloth, the one that carried history and loss and questions she did not have answers to. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the mark recognized something before she did, whether it responded to forces she could not see, and the idea unsettled her more than fear ever had. The attendant paused, glanced toward the doors, then continued, his voice slightly altered, and Alara recognized that sound, the subtle shift people made when authority entered a room, even when it was unannounced. She felt the urge to look up then, curiosity brushing against caution, but she resisted, choosing discipline over impulse, because survival had taught her that discipline mattered more. Still, the air felt different, charged in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and she realized that the hall no longer felt sealed off from the world outside, as if something larger had stepped into its boundaries and refused to remain contained. Alara drew a slow breath, steadying herself, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever happened next would not be ordinary, not for her, and not for the quiet mark resting against her pulse, waiting. Alara sensed the shift fully now, the way the hall seemed to reorient itself around a single point, and although no announcement was made, people straightened unconsciously, voices lowering as if the room itself were listening. She kept her eyes down, but awareness sharpened along her skin, a quiet alertness she had learned to trust, and she noticed how even the exchange attendant paused between words, his practiced neutrality thinning. Footsteps crossed the polished floor with an unhurried confidence that did not need to rush to be acknowledged, and Alara understood then that whoever had entered was accustomed to space being made for him, without asking. Her wrapped wrist warmed again, stronger this time, a steady heat that settled against her pulse, and she clenched her fingers, reminding herself that coincidence did not mean meaning, even when her instincts suggested otherwise. She told herself that powerful people entered rooms like this every day, that authority was not destiny, but the thought felt thin, like a story repeated too often to remain convincing. The murmurs reorganized into something closer to silence as the bidding stalled, and Alara felt eyes drifting toward her, not with interest but with calculation, and she resisted the urge to shrink further, holding herself in careful balance. The presence moved closer, close enough that she could sense it without looking, the air subtly charged, and she focused on the sound of her breathing, the measured cadence that kept her grounded. She remembered being told once that some people carried storms with them, not loud ones, but quiet pressure systems that changed everything nearby, and standing there, she wondered if that was what she felt now. The attendant cleared his throat again and resumed, but his voice had shifted, deferential in a way that was difficult to miss, and Alara recognized that tone as the sound of rules bending. A shadow crossed the light in front of her, and although she did not raise her head, she knew someone stood within a few feet, close enough that the warmth of his presence altered the temperature around her. Her wrist reacted instantly, heat blooming beneath the cloth, not painful, just insistent, and she swallowed, steadying herself against a surge of awareness that felt unearned and dangerous. She thought of the name she hid, of the stories she had been warned never to repeat, of the idea that some bonds did not end simply because time passed, and she forced her thoughts back into order. A voice spoke then, low and controlled, not loud, but clear enough that it carried without effort, and the room responded immediately, the way spaces do when hierarchy asserts itself without argument. Alara did not understand every word, but she understood the effect, the way the exchange paused as if waiting for permission to continue, and she realized that whatever happened next would not follow the script she had prepared for. The attendant confirmed details with quick efficiency, hands moving faster than before, and Alara felt the subtle tug of being claimed by circumstance, not physically, but by decision, the sense that the direction of her life was being adjusted by forces outside her control. The presence beside her shifted slightly, and for a brief, electric second, his hand brushed her wrapped wrist as he gestured, an incidental contact that should have meant nothing. Yet the mark beneath the cloth responded as if recognized, warmth flaring, then settling into a steady pulse that echoed in her chest. Alara's breath caught despite her effort to remain composed, and she lowered her head further, willing the cloth to stay in place, willing the name beneath it to remain hidden, because she knew, with sudden clarity, that this was the moment her careful anonymity could unravel if she allowed it. Around her, the hall waited, suspended, and Alara stood very still, aware that the quiet before change often felt exactly like this, deceptively calm, charged with meaning that could not yet be spoken. The attendant's confirmation ended with a soft chime, and the hall released a collective breath it did not realize it was holding, the kind of exhale that followed an irreversible decision. Alara felt the weight of it settle, not heavy, but certain, and she adjusted her stance as if bracing against a shift in gravity. The presence beside her remained close, not crowding, simply there, and she sensed attention without scrutiny, a focus that did not pry yet somehow noticed everything. The exchange lights dimmed by a fraction, an automated response to priority status, and Alara recognized the protocol even if she had never expected to be subject to it. The attendant spoke again, respectful and efficient, confirming custody transfer and conditions, and Alara listened carefully, parsing the language for traps, because words mattered when power moved quietly. Her wrapped wrist pulsed, heat steady now, like a promise or a warning, and she kept her hands clasped, posture neutral, eyes lowered. She reminded herself that calm was armor, that composure could pass for consent even when choice was limited. The presence shifted slightly, creating a pocket of space that felt deliberate, protective without being possessive, and that unsettled her more than indifference would have. She had learned to expect neglect or control, not this measured consideration. A voice spoke again, closer this time, asking a procedural question with a tone that suggested the answer was expected to be precise, and the attendant responded immediately, deferential and clear. Alara noted the cadence, the absence of wasted words, the way authority did not need emphasis to be effective. She wondered, briefly, if he knew who she was, or if she was simply another variable resolved by protocol, and the thought tightened her chest. The hall resumed its background hum, subdued but functional, as if accommodating a higher order without complaint, and Alara felt herself moving subtly out of the spotlight she had occupied moments before, not erased, but repositioned. The presence turned, and she sensed motion toward the exit, a shift that implied expectation, and she followed without being told, steps measured, matching pace without rushing. The distance between them remained constant, respectful, and she became acutely aware of the sound of her shoes on stone, the faint echo grounding her in the moment. As they moved, the warmth beneath her wrap responded again, not flaring, simply alive, and she focused on keeping her breathing even, because curiosity threatened to rise and curiosity was dangerous. They passed through the wide doors, and the city's muted sounds filtered in, traffic at a distance, voices layered and real, reminding her that the world beyond the hall continued unchanged even as her own circumstances pivoted. The presence paused just outside, long enough to confirm something with a security liaison, and Alara stood quietly, gaze still lowered, aware that she was being seen without being examined, acknowledged without being displayed. The man turned slightly toward her then, close enough that she could sense the steady calm he carried, and for the first time she felt certain that he understood more than he revealed. He did not ask her to look up, did not demand acknowledgment, and the restraint of that choice resonated more deeply than command ever could. Alara realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had stepped into the orbit of someone accustomed to loss and responsibility in equal measure, someone for whom silence was not absence but discipline. The warmth at her wrist settled into a gentle thrum, and she knew, without yet understanding why, that the mark was listening, that the name she hid recognized the quiet authority standing beside her. She kept her gaze lowered, protecting the secret for one more moment, as the path ahead opened and the first step into a different future waited, patient and inevitable. The ride from the exchange hall moved with quiet efficiency, a town car gliding through evening traffic while city lights reflected in clean lines across the windows, and Alara sat with her hands folded, posture composed, absorbing the unfamiliar calm that followed decisive action. The man beside her, whose presence had reshaped the hall without announcement, remained silent, attention directed outward as if giving her space to gather herself, and she appreciated the restraint even as it heightened her awareness. The warmth at her wrist steadied into a low, constant thrum, neither urgent nor fading, and she adjusted the wrap subtly, ensuring the cloth lay smooth and unremarkable. She counted intersections as they passed, recognizing the rhythm of the city, the measured distances between blocks, the way ordinary life continued uninterrupted, and it grounded her more than any reassurance could have. When the car slowed and turned onto a quieter avenue, she sensed a transition, not dramatic, simply purposeful, and she wondered what rules governed this new space she was entering. The vehicle came to a smooth stop, and a door opened with practiced timing, cool air brushing her face as she stepped out, careful, deliberate, matching the pace set without being directed. The building before them was understated, modern lines softened by warm lighting, security present without spectacle, and Alara noted the balance, authority expressed through order rather than display. Inside, the lobby carried a hush that felt intentional, not empty, and she followed a few steps behind as they moved toward a private elevator, her reflection briefly visible in polished metal, composed, contained, still herself. As the doors closed, the man spoke at last, his voice low and even, offering simple instructions about the evening schedule, logistics stated without implication, and Alara listened closely, grateful for clarity where uncertainty had gathered. She responded with a quiet acknowledgment, keeping her tone neutral, aware that every exchange established precedent, and she sensed his attention shift momentarily, not scrutinizing, but registering her steadiness. The elevator ascended smoothly, and with each floor, the warmth at her wrist seemed to synchronize with the gentle hum, a strange alignment she chose not to question yet. When the doors opened, the space beyond felt lived in, not opulent, furnished with purpose and restraint, and Alara recognized the careful curation of someone accustomed to responsibility. She was guided to a sitting area where water was offered, choices presented without pressure, and she accepted with a nod, hands steady as she took the glass, noticing the cool condensation against her skin. The man took a seat across from her, posture relaxed but attentive, and for the first time, Alara lifted her gaze, meeting eyes that carried depth without hardness, grief without fragility, authority without excess. He spoke again, this time addressing her directly, confirming her name with precision, asking a neutral question about her comfort, and she answered honestly, concise, because honesty felt safer than speculation. As they spoke, the mark beneath her wrap warmed subtly, responding to proximity rather than touch, and she kept her wrist still, mind alert, aware that this was a threshold moment, one where silence protected as much as it concealed. He explained boundaries and expectations with care, emphasizing autonomy within structure, and Alara listened, absorbing the unexpected respect threaded through his words. She realized then that the careful distance he maintained was deliberate, an acknowledgment rather than a test, and it eased something tight within her chest. When the conversation paused, a quiet settled that did not demand filling, and Alara felt the weight of the day recede slightly, replaced by cautious steadiness. She did not reveal the mark, did not speak the name she carried, but as the warmth at her wrist pulsed in agreement, she understood that recognition had already begun, subtle and inevitable, waiting for the moment when truth could surface without danger, and she remained composed, prepared, ready to move forward one measured step at a time. Morning arrived softly through sheer curtains, pale light tracing clean lines across the room as Alara woke with a sense of measured calm she did not entirely trust, the kind that followed upheaval when the body had not yet caught up with change. She sat up slowly, listening to the distant hum of the city, grounding herself in ordinary sounds, and noticed immediately the warmth at her wrist, steady and present, more aware now in the quiet than it had been the night before. She adjusted the wrap, careful not to loosen it, and reminded herself that habits kept secrets safe. The space around her felt considered rather than confining, a room designed for rest without erasing independence, and she appreciated the detail even as she catalogued exits out of instinct. A gentle knock came at the door at a reasonable hour, not early, not abrupt, and she answered after a moment, composed, greeted by a staff member who spoke with respectful clarity about breakfast options and the day's schedule. Alara listened, thanked them, and closed the door, absorbing the normalcy offered without demand. She moved through the morning deliberately, choosing simple clothing that did not draw attention, tying her hair back, keeping her movements quiet and precise. When she stepped into the common area, the man from the night before was already there, reviewing documents with calm focus, posture relaxed yet attentive, and he looked up as she entered, acknowledging her presence with a nod that conveyed recognition without intrusion. He asked if she had rested well, the question genuine rather than perfunctory, and she answered honestly, feeling steadier than she had expected. As they spoke, logistics were addressed again, clear and structured, expectations framed as options rather than commands, and Alara noted the consistency. The way respect was not situational but habitual. At one point, as she reached for a cup of coffee, her sleeve shifted despite her care, the fabric catching briefly, and she froze internally as the wrap at her wrist loosened just enough to allow a sliver of pale silver to show. The warmth beneath flared, subtle but unmistakable, and she reacted instantly, adjusting the cloth with practiced ease, hoping the movement appeared ordinary. The man's gaze paused, not sharply, but with a stillness that felt different, as if something in the periphery had registered. He did not comment immediately, and Alara kept her expression neutral, heart steady through discipline rather than absence of fear. A moment passed, then another, conversation resuming on the surface, but she sensed a shift, an undercurrent of attention now focused inward. When he spoke again, his voice was unchanged, but his words circled closer, asking about her past in general terms, where she had learned such composure, such awareness, and she answered carefully, truth threaded with omission, because some truths required timing. As the morning progressed, she became increasingly aware of subtle responses she could not explain, the warmth at her wrist aligning with proximity, with tone, with moments of quiet recognition, and she wondered whether the mark responded to him specifically or to the role he embodied. At last, in a pause that felt deliberate, he addressed the wrap directly, not with accusation, but with calm curiosity, asking if her wrist injury troubled her often. Alara met his gaze then, weighing risk against inevitability, and answered simply that it was not an injury, that it was something she had learned to protect. He studied her for a moment longer, depth and restraint balanced in his expression, and said only that some things deserve protection until the right moment, a statement that resonated more deeply than any question could have. Alara felt the warmth at her wrist settle into a steady, affirming pulse, and she understood that recognition had crossed a threshold, quiet and incomplete, but real, and that whatever truth waited beneath the cloth was no longer unseen, only waiting for the time when it could be acknowledged without harm. The meeting room overlooked the city through tall windows, daylight diffused into a calm glow that softened edges without diminishing clarity, and Alara took her seat with composed attention as several advisors gathered, their arrival measured, voices low, professionalism precise. She sensed the shift immediately, the way rooms changed when decisions carried consequences beyond schedules, and she kept her posture steady, hands folded, the wrap at her wrist smooth and secure. The man at the head of the table listened first, allowing the discussion to unfold without interruption, questions framed around protocols, transitions, and public optics, and Alara noticed how carefully language was chosen, how every term avoided spectacle. As the conversation moved closer to her status, she felt the warmth beneath the cloth answer with a gentle insistence, not urgent, but aware, and she focused on breathing evenly, trusting restraint. One advisor referenced historical precedents in neutral tones, another mentioned legacy considerations without naming specifics, and Alara recognized the dance, the careful circling around truths not yet spoken. When she was addressed directly, The question came framed as concern for her autonomy and well-being, and she responded with clarity, stating what she could accept and what she required, her voice steady, measured, her words carrying weight because they were honest. A brief pause followed, the kind that acknowledged competence without surprise, and the man at the head inclined his head slightly, signaling approval without announcement. As the meeting progressed, attention turned to symbols, to the power of names and marks within public memory, and Alara felt a tightening in her chest as the topic approached the edge of her secret. The warmth at her wrist deepened, a steady pulse that seemed to listen as much as she did, and she considered the balance between protection and truth. When an advisor asked, carefully, whether there were any personal identifiers that might complicate transition narratives, the room grew quiet, not tense, but attentive. Alara met the man's gaze across the table, reading in his expression the same calculus she felt within herself, timing weighed against safety, truth against harm. He spoke then, calmly, asserting that certain matters required discretion until readiness was assured, that premature exposure served no one, and the advisors accepted the boundary without challenge. Alara felt relief tempered by resolve, understanding that protection was temporary, not avoidance. As the meeting concluded, next steps outlined with precision, the group dispersed efficiently, leaving the room settled into a quiet that felt earned. Alara remained seated for a moment, gathering herself, then stood as he did, the city beyond the windows steady and real. He asked, privately, if she wished to step outside for air, an offer rather than an instruction, and she agreed, appreciating the choice. They moved to a balcony where the sounds of the city rose in layered calm, traffic distant, voices indistinct, life continuing. The sunlight caught the edge of her sleeve, and despite her care, the wrap shifted slightly again, enough to reveal a faint glimmer beneath, pale and unmistakable. She moved to adjust it, but his hand lifted, stopping short of contact, a gesture asking permission without words. She paused, heart steady, and nodded once. He did not touch her wrist, only leaned closer, eyes focused, recognition dawning with quiet certainty as the name beneath the cloth became visible for a breath of a moment. The warmth at her wrist aligned with her pulse, steady and true, and she felt the weight of history settle without crushing her. He drew back, expression composed, voice low, stating simply that some names carried continuity beyond time, that honoring them required patience and courage. Alara covered the mark again, the cloth settling, and met his gaze with newfound steadiness, understanding that the truth was no longer hidden in isolation but held within a shared resolve. They stood together for a moment, city light reflecting off glass and steel, and Alara knew that the quiet acknowledgment they shared would change how the world saw her when the time came, not through spectacle, but through recognition earned and carefully revealed. The announcement was handled with deliberate care, released through official channels in measured language that emphasized continuity and respect, and Alara watched the response unfold from a quiet sitting room where sunlight warmed the edges of carefully chosen furniture. Screens displayed neutral headlines, statements crafted to inform without inflaming, and she noted how words shaped reality when wielded responsibly. The advisors moved efficiently, confirming schedules and security with calm assurance, and Alara felt the steadiness of a plan that honored both privacy and truth. When she was escorted to a smaller chamber for preparation, the atmosphere remained unhurried, respectful, and she appreciated the absence of spectacle. A stylist offered options rather than directives, asking preferences and listening, and Alara chose simplicity, fabrics that moved easily, colors that reflected calm rather than command. As she dressed, the warmth at her wrist grew gently brighter, not urgent, but present, and she paused to look at it fully in the mirror, loosening the wrap with intention rather than fear. The name beneath the cloth appeared softly luminous against her skin, familiar and newly weighty, and she felt a swell of emotion she did not resist, gratitude mingled with resolve. She re-wrapped the cloth loosely, not to hide, but to protect until the moment arrived, and stepped forward with measured confidence. In the adjoining hall, he waited with quiet composure, posture relaxed, eyes attentive, and when he saw her, recognition passed between them without need for words. He asked if she was ready, the the question genuine, leaving space for refusal, and Alara answered yes, because readiness did not mean absence of uncertainty, only willingness to proceed. They entered the chamber together where a small group had gathered, advisors and witnesses selected for discretion and integrity, and the room settled into attentive stillness. He spoke first, voice steady, outlining the acknowledgment to be made, honoring legacy while affirming autonomy. And Alara listened, heart steady, aware that this was not a claim but a recognition. When her turn came, she stepped forward, hands steady, and loosened the wrap fully, revealing the name at her wrist without hesitation. The room did not react with shock or spectacle, only with a quiet intake of breath that marked understanding, and Alara felt the warmth align with her pulse, a gentle affirmation. An advisor confirmed the historical continuity with respectful clarity. Another noted the symbolic resonance without embellishment, and Alara realized that justice did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived as agreement reached through care. He acknowledged the mark with a nod, honoring the name it carried, and stated clearly that Alara was not a replacement nor a symbol to be used, but a person whose path intersected with legacy through choice and integrity. The words settled into the room, reshaping the narrative, and Alara felt a sense of balance restored. Formalities concluded efficiently, the group dispersing with purpose, and Alara remained for a moment, breathing in the quiet that followed truth spoken responsibly. Later, as they stepped into public view for a brief appearance, the environment was controlled and calm, questions anticipated and addressed without drama, and Alara stood with composed assurance, gaze level, posture open. The warmth at her wrist was steady, a quiet companion rather than a demand, and she understood that acceptance did not erase the past, it integrated it. When the appearance ended, they returned inside, and he thanked her for her courage without elevating it into expectation, and she thanked him for patience that had made courage possible. As evening approached, city lights gathered beyond the windows, reflections weaving across glass, and Alara felt the day settle into her bones with a sense of earned peace. She knew that recognition would continue to unfold, that some would need time, that others would learn through example, but she also knew that her worth had been affirmed without spectacle or coercion. Standing there, wrist warm and steady, future opening with measured promise, Alara understood that she had not been brought forward to be displayed, but to be seen, and that seeing, done rightly, could change everything. Evening settled into the city with a gentle certainty, lights coming on one by one as if acknowledging the day had reached its natural conclusion, and Alara stood near the window, hands relaxed. The wrap at her wrist now worn openly rather than tightly, a quiet signal of acceptance rather than secrecy. The events of the day replayed not as sharp moments, but as a continuous line, recognition unfolding with patience instead of force, and she felt the steadiness of that truth anchor her more firmly than any declaration could have. He joined her without announcement, standing beside her with the same measured presence she had come to recognize, not imposing, not distant, simply present, and together they watched the city breathe. He spoke softly, reflecting on how legacies survived not through control but through care, and Alara listened, aware that this conversation was not an ending but a beginning shaped by mutual respect. She responded with equal calm, expressing that she understood the weight carried by names and marks, but also the necessity of living beyond them, and he acknowledged her perspective with a nod that conveyed partnership rather than authority. The warmth at her wrist pulsed gently, steady and familiar, no longer demanding attention, simply accompanying her as a reminder of continuity that did not erase choice. Later, as preparations were made for her transition into a new role defined by autonomy rather than obligation, Alara moved through the space with confidence earned rather than bestowed, greeting staff who met her with professionalism unmarred by curiosity, and she realized that dignity could be established through example rather than enforcement. When a small ceremony was proposed, private and restrained, focused on acknowledgment rather than display, Alara agreed, appreciating the intention behind restraint, and the gathering took place with simplicity, words chosen carefully, promises framed as commitments to fairness and protection. He spoke directly to her then, not as a symbol, not as an echo of the past, but as a woman whose presence carried meaning through her own choices. And when he finished, he did something unexpected, lowering himself slightly, not in submission, but in respect, a gesture that reframed power as service. Alara felt emotion rise, not overwhelming, but clarifying, and she responded by meeting his gaze with gratitude and resolve, understanding that equality was not declared, it was practiced. As the moment passed, the room settled into quiet approval, not applause, but a shared understanding that something balanced had been restored. Later still, as night deepened and the city lights shimmered like constellations drawn closer to Earth, Alara returned to her room, pausing to remove the wrap fully, tracing the name at her wrist with gentle fingers, honoring it without surrendering to it. She thought of where she had stood days ago, unseen and reduced, and where she stood now, recognized without being consumed by expectation, and the contrast filled her with a calm gratitude that did not require celebration. In the days to come, challenges would arise, adjustments would be needed, and perceptions would continue to shift, but Alara understood now that she did not walk forward alone nor as a replacement, but as herself, chosen by circumstance yet guided by choice. As she prepared to rest, the warmth at her wrist settled into a quiet stillness, like a story closing one chapter while leaving the book open, and Alara smiled softly, knowing that her future was not defined by how she had been seen before, but by how she chose to be seen now, steady, whole, and finally free.